January 2008, the official U.S. government position, stated by the President, was that the U.S. was committed to ensuring that there would be permanent U.S. military bases in Iraq, permanent options for U.S. military actions in Iraq, and privileged access for U.S. corporations to Iraqi oil. Now that was always in the background, but in the early stages of the war it was kind of hidden under the usual boilerplate of democracy and all the other things. But as the situation got more and more desperate for the U.S., they had to come out with the truth. And by late 2007, early 2008, if you look closely, the official pronouncements were giving the truth. In fact, they were saying exactly what the left had been saying all along, that the goal of the war was to establish a U.S. client state with a major U.S. military presence, or to be in position to dominate the region, and of course to control the energy resources and make sure U.S. corporations had privileged access to them. Now, if you said that through the years of the war, you were considered kind of an anti-American lunatic coming from Mars. But finally, by 2008, they had to concede it publicly, officially. Yes, those were the war aims. And they had to give them up, formally at least. You take a look at the Status of Forces Agreement, the U.S. had to give up on every one of those points. Just as it had to step back year after year from its efforts to prevent any form of democracy and national representation of Iraqi democracy, nationalism. Just had to back off. It's a major defeat. In fact, one of the main books on the war by a very good British analyst, journalist, Jonathan Steele, first rate, it's called Defeat. It's just the history of the U.S. defeat in Iraq. Well, what happens from now on? Well, it depends whether the Iraqis can continue that process. But it's something for us to learn, too. Why was the U.S. forced to back off? Well, the primary reason was Iraqi resistance, nonviolent resistance, a major triumph for nonviolence. But there's a secondary reason, which is right here. The U.S. population would not tolerate the war. U.S. opposition, constantly, it's kind of a principle. If you read something, if something is conventionally believed, you can pretty well take for granted it's false, and the opposite is true. And it's commonly, it's commonly argued across the spectrum that there was no opposition to the war in Iraq, and people, lament how come it wasn't like Vietnam, where we had this huge opposition, but in Iraq somehow there was no opposition. It's exactly the opposite. You take the Vietnam War at any point where it was at the same stage as the Iraq War, and there was no opposition at all. Not only no opposition, but efforts to express opposition were repressed pretty violently, like right here in Boston, for example. Some people here are old enough to remember that in October 1965, after 3 years of war in Vietnam, a couple 100,000 American troops there, South Vietnam practically destroyed. We tried to have our first anti-war demonstration, public one, on the Boston Common, which is the sort of main place for public demonstrations. So there was a small march from Harvard Square to the Boston Common, maybe a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand people at the Boston Common. And it was supposed to be talks. Actually, I was supposed to be one of the speakers. It was broken up by students, violently broken up by students. Couldn't hear a word. The only reason people weren't slaughtered was a couple hundred state policemen there. The next day, the Boston Globe, a liberal newspaper, you probably pick it up on the internet, great applause for the counter-demonstrators. Big picture of the wounded war veteran on the front page, and denunciation of these hideous counter-demonstrators who were asking for things so mild that it was embarrassing. We couldn't even talk about stopping the war in South Vietnam. Instead of talking about maybe stop the bombing of the North or something like that, it's kind of a sideshow. Well, that was 1965. The Iraq War never even got to that stage. But the effects of the anti-war movement in the 60s, and its the expansion of the same popular movements later in many ways, led to a situation where the public simply would not tolerate the measures that were undertaken in South Vietnam. So Kennedy and Johnson had no problem authorizing napalm, B-52 saturation bombing, driving millions of people into concentration camps, whatever they wanted to do, chemical warfare, no protest. They couldn't do that in Iraq. In fact, they never got near it. You can tell it by the casualty figures. The U.S. casualty figures in Iraq are around 4,000. In Vietnam, it was like 60,000. And the troop levels are the same. So they couldn't get anywhere near it, and they were hampered by resistance at home. And a combination of resistance at home and primarily massive resistance in Iraq led to an American defeat. Okay, so back to the question, where does it go from here? Depends how these factors project into the future. We can do something about the ones here. The ones there are their problem. But it's not going to be easy, certainly. I mean, Iraq was practically destroyed. It was nothing like Vietnam. It was totally wiped out. But Iraq suffered a very serious blow in every respect. It's left with one effect of the invasion was to elicit sectarian conflicts, which had really not existed in the past. I mean, as late as about 2005, the Iraqis were saying that there won't ever be sectarian conflicts. We're all intermarried, we live together, and so on and so forth. But when it finally blew up, it got very ugly, as these things do. It's now a rift right through the Middle East. The U.S. war has created major sectarian conflict through Sunni-Shia sectarian conflict through the Middle East, which is threatening to tear the region apart. Those are all big effects. They're problems so serious that they just keep being put off because nobody can dream of how to resolve them, like the state of Kirkuk, which is claimed both by Kurds and Arabs. So they got plenty of problems inside, but maybe they can deal with them somehow. And we can do what we can to prevent the colonial administration from being established, to force the U.S. government to live up to what it's formally agreed to in the Status of Forces Agreement. It's not going to be easy. Obama certainly isn't planning to do it. If you notice that nobody's talking about what's happening to the military bases, so it's pretty hard to find out. There are huge military bases all over the country. I know that they're being taken care of by contractors. The U.S. has sort of farmed out a lot of its military work to private mercenary corporations. And the contractor, I just spoke to a journalist friend of mine who knows the head of the big contracting agency, and he says they're continuing to build the military bases. What's being planned, you have to go to the Obama cabinet to find out, and they're not telling you. We do know that Obama is expanding the city in Baghdad that's called an embassy. It's actually a city. It's a huge construction, a kind of small city inside Baghdad, about the size of the Vatican, which was running at about $1.5 billion a year. Obama's increased it to 1.8 billion for this year. It'll probably go up beyond that, which of course is nothing like any embassy in the world, except for the ones that Obama's building in Islamabad and Kabul, which also tells you what the intentions are. But that means the intention is to try to somehow reverse the defeat. We're not going to give up easily, but how this will pan out depends in large measure on us. Do we want to spend billions of dollars a year to build cities in Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan to ensure that we can control the region, along with military bases and torture chambers and so on? I mean, that's our choice. That's something else that has to do with this first question about the deficit.
So we do have some questions from the groups about anti-war resistance and the difference between Vietnam in the 60s, anti-war resistance then, and resistance to the occupation of Iraq today, and especially under Obama. So we'll go have lunch. We'll ask these questions when we get back, and we'll pick up right back up where we left off.
Chris, could we have volume on this side up a little bit for Chomsky? Yes. Is that okay? It's a little bit low. It was fine, but it's just.
Would it be okay if we move one of these seats? Okay.
I'm ripping the video from before and we'll upload it. Yeah, I asked Lydia and the guys. No, I asked them. I did respect intellectual property.
I'll be brave.
Oh yeah, I'll take that. Thank you.
As long as you're offering, appreciate it.
Is it okay?
Yeah, you can smell like the wonderful artificial.
If you're the infiltrator, you get away with being
Is that a 15 inch?
Sorry?
Have what's the screen size?
Okay. I'm just giving you a cue when you're ready.
Yeah, probably higher. They have like 13, 15, 17.
Yeah, I wouldn't have any way of knowing if
Can I have your attention for just a second? Because we started late, we consulted with those of us doing classes at the 3:30 slot. I'm one of them. And if you don't mind, we will extend this session till 4, and then those sessions will have. We second that. Excuse me, don't interrupt me. So those sessions will be an hour and a half starting at 4. They'll go into the social hour, and you can choose to go to those classes. But if you're going to do something else besides those classes, don't gather at the Z House because it'll interfere with those classes. Don't gather. The dining hall opens at 5:30, etc.
We're actually extending this to 3:30, and the other one starts at 4.
Right. Implied. Did you want to say something, my sweet one?
I second that. Good idea.
All right, so are we clear? Is this okay with you? Because we can always cut it all short, you know, and I'm kidding.
Will the social hour, well, because we're supposed to meet with our project groups at that time, is it going to be cut short?
We've arranged meetings. It's not an assigned project group time.
It's not?
No. I mean, which doesn't mean you won't have one. Check the schedule and see where the classes are at the house at that time, and maybe there's a room that you can use. Otherwise, meander over to Swope because it opens at 5:30. You can meet at those tables forever.
One other thing, at dinner, not that it's rock star time, but still, lunch was very good, but there were about 20 men at the table with Noam. So the rule at dinner is any women who want to sit at the table, if there's any seats left, the guy can sit there, and if there weren't away.
And no faculty at the table.
I second that as well.
There's a bunch of people in there. Yeah.
Pick up where we left off.
I interviewed you at MIT at your office for film speaking about people's movements and you only watch one movie a year, but I finally finished. I was wondering if you might be interested in watching it sometime. Like get you a copy. It's done. Yeah. It's not like it's not about you, but you're in it for a couple. Yeah. Lydia's not no pressure, but I think you'd like it a lot because it shows movements all over the world. Yeah. Thanks for being here.
I'd rather bother you now than while you're eating.
One actually, we're just trying to get people together to get started, so a little later. Can you hear me? Check. Check. Are we ready? And we're going to get started right away, sir. Yes, I will. Okay. Give me a thumbs up when you're ready, camera crew. Are you? I'm recording. Okay. Okay, so here we are with round 2. Hope everybody had a good lunch. Yes. Good. And there was an announcement earlier about the slight time schedule change. If you didn't hear it because you're outside, ask somebody else at some point after the session and you'll get the update then. So picking back up where we left off with the occupation of Iraq, you often cite the mass protests before the invasion of Iraq as evidence of increasing political consciousness since the 1960s. But while popular resistance increased during the escalation of the Vietnam War, it has declined since March 2003. How do you account for this?
Well, first of all, take a look at the history of popular resistance during the Vietnam War, which some of you are old enough to remember. The Vietnam War began in 1950, but it really took off in 1962. It was in 1962 that Kennedy initiated bombing of South Vietnam by the U.S. Air Force. They used South Vietnamese markings, but nobody was, the planes did, but nobody was fooled. It initiated the use of napalm, initiated chemical warfare to destroy crops and ground cover, started some operations against North Vietnam. There were no North Vietnamese anywhere near South Vietnam. And initiated programs which of driving the population into what amounted to concentration camps. They were called strategic hamlets, driving the population into concentration areas where they were surrounded by barbed wire to separate them from the guerrillas who the U.S. government knew that they were supporting. Very similar to what's happening in Afghanistan now. But that was 1962. You could learn about it. I mean, I learned about it by just happening to, for example, if you read the New York Times, if you got to page 27 or something, you could find a small item that reported some of these things casually because it was of no significance. And it continued, the war continued until by 1965, there was one the leading specialist, most highly respected by the U.S. government, civilian specialist, was Bernard Fall. He's a French military historian and Vietnam specialist. So, for example, in Robert McNamara's memoirs, he's the only non-government person mentioned. He was so highly respected. And he was very good. He was very hawkish. But he cared about the Vietnamese, which sort of made him look as if he was on the left. By 1965, he described, I don't remember his exact words, but he said that South Vietnam is just simply being devastated by this enormous U.S. assault. And that's when troops started pouring in. 1965 is also when the U.S. expanded the war to the north. The goal was to try to pressure the North Vietnamese to call off the South Vietnamese resistance. There was no big secret about we now know a lot because a ton of materials come out in the Pentagon Papers and declassified materials, and it more or less adds a lot of depth and complexity to it. All of us could surmise at the time, even from the leaks that were coming along, so no great surprises. But it turns out that the U.S. understood very well that they were fighting the population, that the client government they introduced had essentially no support, and that they just had to fight a military war because that's our comparative advantage. There was no protest. I mean, virtually none. I can remember in as late as 1964, when I was trying to give talks on the Vietnam War, if we were doing it at a college, say at MIT where I was, we'd have to put together about 6 topics. Venezuela, where there was a guerrilla war going on, the Middle East, 5 other topics, and put Vietnam in there somewhere. And then maybe you could get 10 people to come out. Give a talk in a church with 4 people, the minister, the organizer, a drunk who walked in off the streets, and some guy who wanted to kill you, and so on. I mentioned the first public demonstration in October 1965. That was at a time when Vietnam, it was really hanging in the balance. South Vietnam, could it survive? Virtually no protest. By then there were a couple of teach-ins, and there were some small demonstrations. SDS had a demonstration, but very little. By 1967, protest was really taking off. By that time, Bernard Fall again, he was killed in combat in South Vietnam. But his last book, Last Reflections on a War, came out in '67. And in it he says that he thinks it's doubtful that Vietnam will survive as a cultural and historical entity after the massive attack of the most extraordinary military machine that has ever been unleashed against a territory this size. Actually, it got much worse later against Laos and rural Cambodia, but that was '67, speaking about Vietnam. Okay, at that point you began to get protests. By then there were over 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam. The U.S. was extensively bombing the north. It had expanded the war to Laos, beginning to Cambodia, and Fall's account of South Vietnam was quite accurate. So yeah, you started to get protests. And among elites, there was never any protest, literally. So for example, I just, a couple of days ago, happened to read, there's a journal called Diplomatic History, which is one of the main scholarly journals. And among the scholarly journals, it's by far the most serious, but also the most open. It's the one where you can actually get some critical commentary. It's not just regurgitating state propaganda. And some really serious people. They're good, serious scholars. So they happen to have an issue devoted to Vietnam. And it's pretty interesting to read. It tells you a lot about the intellectual culture, the kind of dovish intellectual culture. Almost all the people there would call themselves opponents of the war. But the only positions that are represented are the standard position, which is the U.S. lost the war, which I think is false, and it was a mistake. And then what's called the revisionist position, which is the U.S. could have won the war if they'd fought harder. That's the revisionist position. It's kind of interesting because in the 60s, revisionism meant mild criticism of U.S. Cold War propaganda, like maybe both sides were involved. But the attitudes have shifted so far to the right that revisionism now means the ultra-hawkish position. And the orthodox position is, well, it was a mistake, shouldn't have done it. Kind of like what you could read in Pravda in 1985 about the invasion of Afghanistan, or what you could have heard from the German general staff after Stalingrad, mistake, tactical errors and so on. That's the liberal, dovish, critical position. Among the general population, however, things were changing, and there were big anti-war demonstrations, and there was activism, and it was significant. In January 1968, the Tet Offensive took place. That event has been grossly distorted in history. It was an amazing event. And if you're really interested in popular movements, you should really have a close look at it. South Vietnam was completely saturated with over 500,000 American troops, probably 100,000 or so mercenaries, South Korean, Taiwanese, Philippine, and so on. A huge client army, I think it was maybe 700,000 or so. Every village was penetrated with intelligence and government officials and so on. Nobody knew that the Tet Offensive was coming. It was a simultaneous uprising all over South Vietnam, took everybody by surprise. What that meant is that in every South Vietnamese village, people were already organized to rise up on a particular moment against the occupation, and it came as a complete surprise to the occupiers. That means nobody talked about it, or if somebody did talk about it, the eyes didn't see it and the ears didn't hear it. I don't think there's an event like that in history, of a spontaneous mass popular uprising. Well, the U.S. did succeed in putting it down by massive violence, extremely destructive. And now it's treated, for example, in this issue of diplomatic history that I mentioned, as a defeat for North Vietnam. Actually, North Vietnam wasn't even there. There were North Vietnamese troops, about 50,000 of them, a fraction of 10% of U.S. troops, but they were on the borders. They weren't in South Vietnam. In fact, they were on the borders, basically trying to draw American troops away from the country so that the uprising could take place. But this is called a defeat for the North Vietnamese, because ultimately, with massive firepower, the U.S. was able to put down the uprising. So that's the way it enters history, defeat for the North Vietnamese. But what actually happened is quite astonishing. And power centers in the United States understood it. Intellectuals still don't understand it, but the business community understood it. And basically, the business community at that point, there was a very interesting power play. There was a group called the Wise Men, big Wall Street hotshots and so on, who went to Washington and read the President a Riot Act. They told him, look, you're going to withdraw. You're going to have to stop escalating the war. It's costing us too much. It's harming the economy. Population's in an uproar. So you got to stop the bombing of North Vietnam, announce that you're not going to run for president. The election was coming up. Start negotiation and initiate withdrawal plans. And the president obediently did everything he was ordered to do instantaneously. Gives you good insight into how American politics works. In the intellectual community, something extremely interesting happened. It all of a sudden turned out that everybody had been a long-time opponent of the war. So the Kennedy memoirists, there were a lot of memoirs about Camelot and how wonderful it was. The Kennedy memoirists, Schlesinger, Sorensen, the rest of them, immediately rewrote all their histories, literally. Completely rewrote it, inventing the story, the fairy tale, which is very common on the left now, that Kennedy was trying to get out of the war. Total fairy tale, not a particle of evidence for it. He was a complete hawk. And if you look at their earlier memoirs at the time, They barely even mentioned Vietnam. They just took it for granted. Of course, if we want to destroy the country, who cares? You know? People like Arthur Schlesinger, Robert Kennedy, they shifted. All of that passed without notice. You can't find a word about it in the history of the current history of the period. Okay, so we were lying like troopers, but we changed. Now we created a false history for ourselves, and that's fine. If you look at the Pentagon Papers, the Pentagon Papers ends around mid-68, right, a couple of months after the Tet Offensive. And the section on the last few months is extremely interesting, so interesting that it's never discussed. I don't think you can find a reference to it except in what I wrote and what Howard Zinn wrote and a couple other people. But it's quite interesting. It was a real shock in Washington. Up until that point, they thought they're going to win the war. And all of a sudden, it turned out there's this mass popular movement which had carried out this incredible event, and it's going to go on for a long time. Johnson, the president, wanted to send a couple 100,000 more troops to Vietnam after the Tet Offensive. The military didn't want to. Joint Chiefs were opposed for an interesting reason. They said if we send more troops, we're going to have a civil war in the United States. We're going to need those troops for civil disorder control, because there'll be an uprising by young people, by women, by minorities, and so on, and we're going to need the army to put it down. So we don't want to send any more troops. Johnson didn't send any more troops, partly that, partly the business world telling him it's over. Well, you know, those are all... In fact, why did the business world think there was an economic crisis? That's interesting, too. One of the real achievements of the anti-war movement, which you never find in the histories, and there are lots of scholarly books now about the anti-war movement, but they never mention its major achievement, because it's kind of ideologically impossible to incorporate into your version of the world. What the anti-war movement did was create enough disorder and opposition so that the government could never declare a national mobilization. Now, if you declare a national mobilization, first of all, it's extremely efficient for the economy. Like during the Second World War, when there was a national mobilization, the U.S. had its fastest growth in economic history. I mean, industrial production quadrupled. People were dedicated to the war effort, you know, Rosie the Riveter and all that kind of business, which was real. People were really dedicated to the war effort, and it was, for the economy, fantastic. It pulled the country out of depression, set the basis for post-war growth. Of course, it won the war, a huge war. But Johnson couldn't do it. There was too much discontent. So they could never call a national mobilization. They had to fight what's called a guns and butter war. So you pour money into the military, but you've got to keep the population satisfied. So that's the butter side. And that is inefficient, economically inefficient. It harms the economy. It led to stagflation, a combination of stagnation of growth and inflation, which was harming the economy. And that's what the business community understood would get much worse if they tried to escalate the war or even to continue it. So that's a major effect of the anti-war movement, but which only took off around 67, you know, shortly before this, you know, literally months before the Tet Offensive. Well, then it goes on. I won't go through the rest of the history, but it's pretty much the same. So those were the, and then it left a lasting impact on the country. So anti-war feelings just developed and grew along with a lot of other changes. I mean, the major effect of the 60s wasn't really felt then. So the major popular movements, like, say, the feminist movement, which had a huge impact on the country, probably more than anything else, but that's really from the 70s. I mean, it was started in the 60s, you know, there are bits and pieces of it, but kind of really took off in the 70s. There was no environmental, barely any environmental movement in the 60s. It started around 1970, Earth Day, and so on. And the same is true of the anti-nuclear movement, 80s, and so on. It all comes later, the solidarity movements of the 1980s. But it had its roots in the activism of the 60s, and it kept expanding. Under a lot of repression, there were major efforts to try to beat it back. all kind of ways. I mean, the war on drugs, I can go into this if you like, but a large part of it was a very explicit effort, not concealed, to try to put down, to impose what was called law and order, to get the society to be passive and obedient again, and also to reverse the concern that by 1970 the population, though not the elites, were actually beginning to seriously question the righteousness and justice of American policy, and that's dangerous. It was very well understood by 1970 that the whole culture is shifting in a dangerous direction, where you don't just reflexively assume that whatever the U.S. government does is right and just, though it may be mistaken, which is virtually uniform in the intellectual world. I mean, those of you who are in, study these things in college, it's just like it's like an axiom. You can't even question it. If you question it, you're considered a madman. But among the population, that was being very seriously questioned. In fact, polls were showing that about 70% of the population described the war as not a mistake, but fundamentally wrong and immoral. Okay, that's pretty scary. Kind of like sit-down strikes in the 30s. It's really scary. So you had to do something so that we held the moral high ground, that we're the victims of the Vietnamese. Sounds like a hard thing to carry off, but it was done brilliantly. And the war on drugs was a major part of it. In part, it had other purposes, like imprisoning the black population. It's another story. But part of it was trying to gain the moral high ground in the war in Vietnam. Quite tricky when you've just, destroyed 4 countries, killed a couple million people in a war of aggression that had absolutely no credible pretext. But it was done. And the drug war was a central part of it. Around 1970 or so, a lot of propaganda started about an addicted army. It's a myth. There was no, in fact, there's a very good book, scholarly book on it, The Myth of the Addicted Army by Jerry Kuzmarov. Goes into a lot of the details. But the basic story is that the army, soldiers were using drugs, but at about the same level as civilians at home. I mean, they're young people, so it's kind of like the youth culture. And they were using drugs at about the level of the youth culture. It had no effect on combat that anybody could ever detect. There was actual addiction in the army, but it was alcohol and tobacco, both of which are much more serious than what are called drugs. And that was serious, but that's not called addiction, because that's what rich people do. But a myth was created about an addicted army, and that was contrived, reconstructed as an effort by the evil communists to attack us. They were addicting our army to try to turn our army into a collection of junkies who'd come home and riots in the streets and destroy the country and so on. And that was extremely effective. You had people like Walter Cronkite, who you may remember or know was the great liberal hero on television. Walter Cronkite giving lecturing on his television programs about how our boys in Vietnam not only have to face the guns of these evil communists who are daring to defend their own villages, but also to face the drugs that they're trying to addict our soldiers with. So they're facing 2 kinds of enemies. So we're really the victims of the Vietnamese who are attacking us with not only their guns, but even their drugs. And so the idea that the Vietnamese are attacking us with their guns was deeply rooted. You go back to the Camelot days, Kennedy. It's exactly what they said. So Adlai Stevenson, who was the liberal hero, UN ambassador, he was giving talks at the UN about how in South Vietnam we're fighting a new kind of war, a war of what he called internal aggression. What's that? That means the South Vietnamese are carrying out aggression against us in South Vietnam. President Kennedy spoke about what he called the assault from within. They're attacking us from within Vietnam. by now that's like second nature. So Iraq and Afghanistan are described exactly the same way. Come back to it if you like. It's an assault from within, aggression against us in their country. Israel does the same thing. They talk about Iranian aggression against Israel in South Lebanon, where the Israeli army was occupying it, and there was guerrilla resistance. So that's Iranian aggression against Israel in South Lebanon. These are, you know, in imperial history, there's a lot of horrible stuff, but it's pretty hard to find anything that's this grotesque. But by now it's just like second nature in the U.S. intellectual culture. So Kennedy and Stevenson, nobody objected when they talked in those terms. And by 1970 or so, you get the liberal icons like Walter Cronkite saying, well, they're attacking us not only with guns, but even with drugs. So we're the victims of the Vietnamese. It was a very successful propaganda campaign. Just carry it forward. By 1977, time to get to Carter. Carter was president. He was actually asked in a press conference, do we owe some debt to the Vietnamese? You know, after all, killed maybe 4 million people, destroyed their country and so on. He said, we owe them no debt because the destruction was mutual. So, yeah, we did some things to them, but look at what they did to us. So it's mutual, so it's finished. Actually, the French say exactly the same thing today about what they did to Haiti. I mean, they just wiped out Haiti. I mean, it's a long, complicated story. A lot of France's wealth comes from it. But they say, well, you know, we don't owe them anything because look what they did to us. I mean, they stole our property, namely the slave plantations. They didn't pay an indemnity for it. Actually, they did pay an indemnity. And look at how many white people they killed when they liberated themselves. So it's all even, you know. This goes on all the time, but it's particularly egregious here. So by 1977, we owe them no debt because the destruction was mutual. That's Jimmy Carter, you know, great liberal. By the time you get to George Bush #1, that's like 1990, it's going even further. Bush was giving orations about how there were discussions then about whether to lift the sanctions on Vietnam. The war didn't come to an end when we stopped bombing them. Imposed heavy sanctions.